Hey there, how's it going? My name is Meiker, and today I'll be showing you a demonstration on how I make dress-up games. Don't worry, I'll be divided into parts, so please listen. You know that making dress-up games is quite hard and time-consuming, and it takes like forever. Besides, they've got other things to do, such as school or work or whatever. Anyway, speaking of this game, it's going to be a game based on the character Morris Buttermaker on the Bad News Bears. And as you see here, I've already set up my canvas to wait a minute. Two. 600 times 900 pixels. Why? Because, forgive my mouse, my zooming. Because this, I believe, is the optimal length for a full-bodied Maker.io game. But if you're going for a portrait type game, it's best to use 600 by 600 pixels, because I believe these two are indeed the optimal sizes for a Maker.io game. But the 600 times 600 can also apply to pit crew avatar makers as well. And since this is part 1 of our making of a dress-up game series, it should cover underdrawings, then the outlines, and maybe colors. But if I can't make it, then colors will be your best bet in the next part. Okay? Now sit back, relax, and enjoy this segment. Since it's the part where I draw the doll, I'd like to discuss with you a few things. So, first of all, in case you're uninitiated, what the heck is Maker.io? Okay, I have the answer for you. Maker.io is this website where you get to create your own custom dress-up games and doll makers and the like. It's pretty much like Pit Crew, but with more freedom. And yes, you get to submit the games with a PSD format. And boom! Magic occurs! Now, I'll discuss with you what my process in making dress-up games is like. First of all, it starts off with a general idea on what it's going to be all about. Usually though, it's related to my interests, but that's okay though. Then, during the pre-production stage, I do cruddy concept art and doodles and other stuff like that, because they give me a general idea on what the game will look like, to be exact. And sometimes, in this game's case, I do mock-up art as well, to be exact, if you know what I mean. And now, once I open the PSD, I usually have a hard time drawing the doll skeletons, because I need to get everything right, down from the doll size to the proportions. It's basically a trial and error period until you feel you get it right and set. Now, let me talk to you about the bad news bears. It's this movie from the 1970s which tells about a swimming pool cleaner, that is the subject matter of our dress-up game, who one day has to coach a youth baseball team, which consists of nothing but a bunch of losers and misfits. So he decides to recruit 2 more kids into the mix in hopes of leading them to victory. In fact, one of my aunts watched that movie as a kid growing up in the 70s, and it's actually a very, very fun movie to watch. Feel free to check it out for yourself if you like to. Let's discuss on how I draw doll. First and foremost, I divide the doll into several different layers and assign each layer with its own color so I can tell which layer is which before I can unify them all with one singular color. But each creator has their own methods and they change from time to time. You see, when I was younger, I used to draw dolls in only one layer, and this led to some awkward looking results to be exact. But hey, I've learned my lesson. I'm still learning up to this day. not to mention in this one, it's a trial and error period. Besides, I had a hard time growing his feet until I got the right reference images. So references are your best friend. Remember that, folks. As a related side note, I had to give the Buttermaker doll some details, such as chest hair, because I don't want him to look that idealized much. I was originally going to draw maybe both arms in one layer each, but when I was done with Buttermaker's left arm, I suddenly thought to myself, maybe the items he holds will look awkward, so let's separate both fingers and arms into separate layers. And so I did. And you'd better be careful with those hands and arms, because you know, these things, they're quite tricky to draw. This is the part where I color all the doll's layers with at least one skin tone, even though that means the doll would be less colorful. If this were the kind of dress-up game where you pick the skin tones, it might just have taken a lot much longer, and you'd see me duplicating stuff and making icons, I think. But hey, I'm sticking to at least one skin tone, so that's it, really. Maker.io has this rule that states you have to cover up your doll's naughty bits. Even though I drew Buttermaker's genitals as Barbie doll types rather than anatomically correct ones, as if not to offend anyone on this, it's a good thing I drew a pair of briefs on him so he'd look more decent. If not, I would have been kicked out of Meiker. So since this is all what we have for now, the Buttermaker doll himself looks good, but there's some issues I'll be needing to address, so please listen. First of all, take a look at the left armpit. For instance, as you see here, I didn't draw any proper room for the armpit, but that's okay. Aside from that, you could see some transparent specks on his neck bone area, aside from the face and head and the left leg area as well. You can even see one on the right foot too. Aside from that, the color used for the body is overlapping with the outlines, but don't worry, they'll also be fixed as well. And yes, sometimes it could be downright confusing, especially if you're working with a lot of players, especially with his left hand, but I don't know if I'll fix it. But I'll do a better job next time. So since this is my first video, I'm not expecting you to take it seriously. But if you like, feel free to share this video with your friends. Comment down below whether it's for suggestions for this dress-up game or otherwise. Critique on this video or whatever you feel like to say. So I'd like to thank you all for watching this video, and I hope you learned a little something today or two. And I'll definitely see you guys around the time we get to part 2. If I have the time to do that. So, bye!